The naming convention for specifying property is little bit different. For example, Spring application name. In this case, the way we need to specify in the Docker Compose is in capitalize everything with all the all the delimiting thing with underscore. So application and name. So this is how we need to specify in Docker Compose file in Kubernetes deployment object. So here we will specify the detail about the application name. We will specify the detail about the location from where we want to pick up these particular configurations detail that we have added right here. In our case, what we will be using is the one that we have defined in the Docker files. We will be using the app config. So here, first thing that we need to specify right below where the image and the names are being added is environment tag. Inside this one, we will indent to, and this accepts a list. So we have to provide the name and the value pair. So first property is Spring application name, and the value is the same as this one, right? So we can pick this one. The next property that we want to use is Spring profile active. So again, you don't need to specify this, but still for the sake of the specifying, I will be specifying Spring profiles active and value is native. And the third property that I want to specify is Spring Cloud Config Server native search location, right? So this I will specify here with capitalized name Spring Cloud Config Server native search locations, and value is app config. So this way we have created most of the things that we need to add for the deployment object. This is the bare minimum things we need to create the deployment object. Defining pod is not enough to expose deployment object. And for that one, it is required to be defined the service objects. Service object will tell Kubernetes how to expose pod to the outer world or maybe to the cluster. So defining this service object is very similar to what we have defined for deployment objects. What we will do is we will define service objects right inside the same file. We can define that by separating with 3 lines. This is the syntax that Kubernetes follows. You can add as many different objects as you want with adding 3 lines here. So similar to the pod that we have defined, we also need to define a API version. Here the API version is just v1. In case of the deployment object, it was app v1. Again, you can refer to the official Kubernetes reference guide and you will be able to get the latest service objects. Again, like the way we have defined for the deployment object, we also need to define the kind. In case of the service object, we have to say service as the kind that we want to define, and here the service objects service names S should be capital, Similar to similar to what we have done in the deployment objects, we also need to define metadata. And again, name of this metadata. In this case, the way we have defined the deployment objects, we call this as a service. Okay, and remaining things that we will define inside the spec. In the spec, we again need to define the selector, and the selector that we are going to use is not of the deployment, but we will use the selector of the pod that we want to expose. So in this case, we want to expose a pod with the name config server. So we will add these details right here inside the selectors. Making sure to define the selector is very important. For example, let's say you have defined some more selector here as a train service, and maybe you have got a similar deployment object with a project as, let's say, as a flight service. Okay, so here you can define the selector like this single. So you may have defined the app config server in both the places with the same name. So what it will do is it will try to expose, it will try to define the service for both. So selectors are very powerful tool in a Kubernetes. It allows you to make a multiple labels. It allows you to select multiple labels, or if you want to drill down further and not expose all the services with the config server, you can just define like, okay, I just want to expose a project train service as well. So it will not pick the one that is defined with the project flight, but it will just pick the selector with just these two labels that we have defined, and the labels are key value pair, and the key value pair can be anything. You can define your own key and you can define your own value as well. In our case, we don't want to add this, just want to make it simple. So we will delete this extra labels that we have defined. Next thing that we need to define is type and the ports details. The type that tells Kubernetes that how do you want to expose the pod. One type is the load balancer that tells that this is exposing to the outer world. So from the outside of this cluster, we should be able to access this pod. Cluster IP is the one that tells, and this is also the default type that tells that only inside the cluster only you should be able to access the pod. And the next one is the node port. So most of the times we don't use the node port because this exposes only through the IP. So that is why node port is mostly not being used, but mostly we either use cluster IP or the load balancer. The next thing that we need to define is the ports. The ports is an array, that is why it is taking a list. In our case, we want to use only one port that we want to expose. The target port is the internal port that we have defined this, and the outside world that we want to expose with the same port. That is why we are using the same port, that is internal and the external. And the protocol is always in our case we want to use as a TCP. So this is all we need to define for the service objects. So this concludes the deployment object and the service object for our need. And now we will start adding the volume details in the next video. So thank you very much for watching this video.